Okay, so my name is Chad Page. I'm the USU sheep and goat specialist. I'm excited to speak today with all of you. I was going to kind of start off this webinar series that has a very stacked program with a lot of good things based around sheep production and nutrition. What I love about sheep production is that uh, it's somewhat of a small industry, and so those of us who dabble in it tend to be kind of a jack of all trades. We do a little bit of parasite stuff, a little bit of repro, a little bit of nutrition. Being kind of trained more as a nutritionist myself, I really like to look at how nutrition affects production. Utah, we're pretty different than Hawaii, I would say, in how we utilize our natural resources and what kind of natural resources we have. So here you kind of see a picture of some wool type sheep. These are mainly a Rambouillet, Targhee type sheep. From what I understand, Hawaii has a lot of hair sheep. I'd imagine a lot of Katahdin cross, maybe a little bit of Dorper genetics or Black Belly Barbados, some of those types of sheep. And so the things I talk about today can really be kind of drawn across multiple breed types and things like that. And so if there is a question, feel free to ask. And this can be, if it's okay, I wouldn't mind if this is somewhat of an interactive half hour that I have to talk with you. I did want to share a couple tools real quick. Um, if for those of you been on the Sheep 201 website put out by the University of Maryland, their sheep specialist does a great job putting together material. And this is a chart that they put together outlining some of the different ration balancing software. And so if you want to look into looking at the different nutrient requirements that we utilize for our sheep and goats, this is a really good place to go to just plug in some of the numbers of maybe what's the nutrient quality of your pasture that you're using or the feed that you're giving to your animals. And you can see that this is kind of broken down by species. So we have both sheep and goats represented. Some of these programs cost money, but some are free. So Montana State University has a cheap or has a free ration balancing software. And so these are good tools to utilize if you're just at least trying to get in the ballpark of what your animals truly need. First and foremost, I just want to point out the importance of body condition scoring. When we're kind of learning how to feed our animals, body condition scoring can be a really easy, cheap tool that helps us to know if our animals are getting what they need nutrient wise or if they're not. And ultimately, their body condition score is going to be one of the best ways just to look and see how they're doing metabolically, right? If they're under conditioned, oftentimes they don't perform. So if you look at this hierarchy of importance, maintenance is the first thing. The animal's going to stay alive. All the organs are going to be functioning. After that, they grow. And then as they go on, some of those other things like breeding up, putting on fat, those things only come after the animal has taken care of itself. And so I like to say that reproduction is a luxury event. Only after you take care of the animal will things come through. If if you're looking at this, those of you who maybe haven't body condition scored, it's pretty easy. In my country, I always tell people they have to put hands on because we have a lot of wool sheep that can hide the body condition score. However, if we're dealing with a lot of hair sheep and goats, then we have the ability to give a body score assessment from the side of the pen, which is actually really great, especially if our animals are out in pasture and maybe hard to get our hands on all the time. But what we want to do, and I think maybe if instead of looking at these sheep here, you can kind of get an idea of the amount of fat in some of these areas around the spinal process. And so you can see that the spine protrudes more with a low body condition score, and then it is completely covered with fat with very high body condition score. Usually where we want our sheep to be is right around a 3, 3.5, especially as we're going into a breeding season or we're getting ready to lactate, just because that's such a demanding time nutritionally. Um, the sheep industry is very different than the cattle industry. So those of you who may be raising cattle versus sheep, in the cattle industry, we often ask our animals to get pregnant while they're lactating, and that's a really high demand nutritionally. In the sheep world, however, if you're lambing one time a year, you actually have a portion of time that you can actually keep your animal at maintenance. And so if you're using your animals for things like brush control, or they're not actively raising lambs or things like that, it's okay to see your animals at a slightly lower body condition score, especially if you're asking them to eat things that maybe are a little bit less palatable, or that they're less likely to eat without a little bit more control. And in that case, we'd be utilizing them more as a tool, kind of like in our solar grazing programs and things like that. Um, so this is kind of a chart just to show that there is some fluctuation in body condition score. One body condition score is usually somewhere between 12 and 14% of your body weight. And so if you have a ewe that is, I would say a lot of the hair sheep I encounter, the Katahdins, are a little under 150, just kind of depending. Uh, Pretty light animals. This gives you an idea of how fast or slow maybe you could move up a body condition score in order to put on some weight. Okay. So that's just one easy way that, I don't know about you guys, but growing up uh, in Arizona, we didn't have a lot of money to send off samples and things like that. And so just being able to look at our animals and get an idea of, are they fat or are they skinny? Is this right based on their stage of production? Should I feed them a little bit more? And maybe if we're debating getting supplementation or not, and we look out at our animals and our average body condition score is closer to a 2 than a 3, but we're coming up on breeding season, maybe we want to put out some supplementation to them. And those are just really easy, non-scientific ways that we can go about doing this. And so, but now kind of getting into what they need for sure, there are these different nutritional demands that they have. So we're going to talk a little bit about water, energy needs with carbohydrates, lipids, protein, minerals, and vitamins a little bit. And I know there's some great talks on here later that are going to cover minerals and vitamins, or minerals in a little bit more detail. And so I'm not going to go too much into that. Water, honestly, is the most important thing. And I didn't used to really understand this until I did a large research project where I carried hundreds of gallons of water to individual ewes in jugs at a research station in Idaho. And there would be some animals that would just drink it down every single day, no matter what. But there would be some animals that they'd always drink it down. But if it got just a little bit dirty, they wouldn't touch it. And I think it showed how important it is to have clean water, or maybe in really hot environments. I'm trying to think of the weather in Hawaii. If that water is open to the sun all day long and it's really hot, those animals will probably less likely to drink it than if you had water maybe under a shade structure. And so temperature, water, cleanliness of water are really big things. Also, some water contaminants can also drive down mineral absorption and things like that. And so having good, clean water is really important. Here's kind of, we talked about stage of production and body condition scoring. Here's kind of the stage, or the different stages of production with energy requirements for our ewes. And this particular case is a 150-pound ewe, looking at the energy requirements. So you can see that those energy requirements are much less in maintenance than they are going into late gestation and early lactation. Early lactation is going to be really the crux of where all our grocery bills go to. Or if our animals are out on pasture, this time period here in late gestation, early lactation is where you probably really want to make sure that your animals are getting some supplementation if they need it in order to raise the most pounds of lamb or things like that. Now, if you're in grazing situations where you're using your animal more as a tool, but you still don't want to lose um, any loss on production, you may think about using some of those animals that come open or that are in maintenance in those situations versus the animals that are trying to lactate and um, utilize energy for that. So another thing to point out, and this is moving into the protein requirements, showing some of the differences here, is how much our twins demand of our ewes. And so, unlike, cattle or even horses or things like that, when we're dealing with these animals that have multiple offspring, that's pretty demanding. One thing, and just kind of thinking of the dairy world a little bit, when we think about how much milk a cow produces, we can influence how much that cow produces on how many times we milk it in a day. The more you remove the milk, the more milk they'll produce. And so when we have more lambs nursing on a ewe, she's going to produce more milk, and her energy and her protein requirements are going to go up fairly significantly. So you can see here that in early to late lactation, there's roughly a 30 to 35% difference between those ewes that are just raising a single versus those that are raising twins. Now, if you're grafting ewes, if you're taking maybe some of the triplets your Katahdins are dropping, and you're grafting a third lamb over onto a ewe that only had a single, you still need to make sure that she is being fed as if she's raising twins. And so give her the credit for the work she's doing, not just what she lambed, if that makes any sense. And kind of going with this, because I think this is really important and a lot of people fall into this nutritionally. One thing that happens often is that our animals draw, with these litter-bearing species, they draw so much energy from themselves that oftentimes we'll end up with pregnancy toxemia. And so this is essentially when the sheep goes into a state of ketosis in late gestation. And part of this is largely due to the fact that these fetuses are growing so rapidly that they're pushing up against all the other material in their abdomen, and they're pushing up against that rumen. So instead of having a big rumen that she can eat all the grass in the pasture, fill it, and digest, she's now got a much smaller rumen space to digest, and she's unable to even eat the amount that she needs. And so there's a couple ways you can try to combat this. You can try to reduce the feed stuff. So maybe feed like a pellet or a supplement with high concentrate energy, or chop down feed, reduce particle size, things like that. There's a couple of different ways you can treat it also. But what I kind of want to show is how drastic this is based on the number of lambs that you have. And so if you look at these are BHBAs and NEFAs, stand for non-esterified fatty acids, and beta hydroxybutyrate. This is essentially the markers for ketosis. How are they going into ketosis? And if you look at this, these really prolific ewes, which a lot of our hair sheep are very prolific. Black Belly Barbados on my operation when I was a kid almost always dropped twins and triplets. Same with a lot of Katahdins I've been around. And so if you see these triplets and quads that these ewes are producing, they have much higher ketone bodies in their blood. And that's starting to happen really from 5 weeks out from lambing. And so really around, a month out from lambing, you should be thinking about supplementing some of these ewes that you're expecting to have high number of lambs. Here's kind of some looking at, I'm not going to go a ton into this, but this is kind of looking if you were to start designing rations to meet energy and protein and different feed resources. I think a lot of us are probably raising sheep on pasture, from what I understand. And so maybe this isn't quite as relevant because it's hard to measure how much they're eating on pasture. But it does give you a good idea that if you're pasture only gave so much energy, um, you may want to look at either supplementing energy or supplementing protein, depending on the stage of production. One thing that is pretty common, and I apologize to any of my presenters if I'm stealing any thunder, but there is a lot of research that shows a lot of the minerals on pastures and rangelands is not sufficient for what we need for our animals. So this is one study in Idaho that was done. My master's project did a very similar thing, and we saw that if you didn't supplement, you actually had a large amount of animals that were deficient in different minerals. Um, and soil geochemistry here across the states is kind of similar. But I only say this because I'm trying to drive home the point that if you're in an area that has need for supplementation of mineral, um, we should be looking at supplementing it because a lot of these minerals are very crucial to the growth of our lambs. One problem in the Mountain West, where I am at currently, is things like selenium deficiency that causes white muscle disease in the lambs. Another mineral is zinc, which is involved in a lot of things, even some old research showing the lack of growth in some animals with lower zinc concentration. Um, and so we're going to talk about some of the mineral stuff we're doing and how it changes grazing distribution in just a second. But kind of one of the last things on some of our small farm flocks is nutritional management of lambs, especially bum lambs or orphan lambs. Some people are starting to call them bonus lambs, but they can be extremely challenging in that it's a lot of money to buy milk replacer. Currently, I don't know what it is in Hawaii, but stateside right now, it is roughly $3 to $4 per pound milk replacer, and it makes it really hard economically to do that. But a lot of questions I get is what should that milk replacer have? And one night I just stayed up and I looked across all the different milk replacers commercially that I could find across kid goats, and lambs. And what I really found between the two is that they're pretty similar. The one big difference, though, is that lamb milk replacer generally has higher fat content, so higher energy needs for some of our lambs. And so if you're looking at buying milk replacers and things like that nutritionally on your small flock, you may want to try to make sure that you're maybe going species specific because some of these lambs do require a little bit more fat or energy than our goats do. Um, so I'm gonna kind of get into the beauty of why I really like sheep. Um, Sheep are kind of like this, I don't know, they're not a unicorn, but they uh they do select so many different things as far as grazing that it makes them really fun to do research and how supplementation may change what they select for, or depending on what season they're grazing, what they're selecting for. And it's really fun to just kind of go out and watch sheep. Goats are really browsy, which is great for us, putting them out as tools to graze back woody plants and things like that. And then grass is kind of an always a go-to. And cattle really, the story with cattle is that cattle love grass. Sheep kind of prefer forbs, then grass, then browse, whereas goats are mainly browse. But each one of these plants has a very different nutritional makeup. And so as a scientist, I'm really interested in, well, how are they selecting for different plants in order to change their nutritional demands or meet their nutritional requirements? So I have a student who looks so rustic on this picture right here, but his name is Ryan. And I've had him out in the mountains looking at how mineral supplementation changes how these animals graze in very diverse rangeland environments. So these environments have brush and shrub and browse and grass, many grass species, and things like that. And so what we wanted to see is, well, if we put out mineral, how is this mineral going to make them change where they graze, what they graze? Are they going to become more browsy if we don't give them mineral? And so we stuck out this trailer that measured all the mineral that they uh, ate on the mountain, and we gave access to some animals, but some animals, if they didn't have, if they weren't in allowed, they didn't get any mineral. There was a little gate on this feeder that didn't allow them access. And so we pulled this trailer all around the mountain for the summer, for a couple summers. Um, and we had a bunch of animals that we were taking blood samples on, some liver biopsies, but we were also collecting fecal samples to look at fecal metabarcoding. And so as we moved around this mountain, here are a couple different aerial shots. We also took samples of all the forages available. Here's kind of a time frame of that, of when we took samples throughout the summer. But we kind of use this new tool that some people are starting to utilize more on the science end. I'm not sure if I am convinced on the producer aspect of it yet, just because of the cost. But it essentially looks at the DNA makeup of the plants in the fecal matter that these animals are consuming. And so we got a pretty good idea of what plants, what type of plants they're eating just by taking a fecal sample. And so after analyzing all the data and seeing how much mineral all these sheep ate, we compared it to that fecal metabarcoding technique that I just talked about, and we got a good idea of how was that mineral supplementation changing what they ate. And so this kind of shows some of the differences in the diet selection based on our treatment. So there would be treatment here, and then control, which is essentially the ewes that had no access to any mineral supplementation or salt. And what you could see is that their diets were pretty similar. So there's a lot of stuff I see going around social media of saying cafeteria mineral supplementation is one that keeps popping up. We did a lot of that back in the 80s, before my time, but it was proven pretty false. And what happens is animals tend to go after things that are more palatable. And so as we looked across this, even though we were supplementing some with additional selenium and zinc and all these things, it really wasn't changing what they were eating to a great degree, right? And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Here's another one that looks at two different pastures, and from what we can see is, yes, there's a difference in what they ate, but these were also two different sites, right? And so one site probably had way more grass than the other site, or it was two different times of the year. Maybe the grass was less palatable at that time when they were on one pasture versus another. And so this would be fairly normal to what we would think. But in looking at all the production data of these animals, we looked at the weight across the season, and some of these ewes had lambs on them as they were out on the mountain, and so they were lactating. Remember, we talked about those high energy needs, high protein needs during lactation. Some of these ewes had lambs on them, but in the end, at the very end of the study, there really wasn't a difference between those ewes that were given mineral and those that weren't. And so we've spent so much time looking at mineral status of these animals, even myself through my own graduate program. And then I do a research project like this that pretty much says, well, you supplement them or not, and they're going to about perform the same. But I think it goes a little bit beyond that. It goes back to that kind of unicorn aspect of sheep and why I love them. That sheep have such a diverse diet that they're in places that have a plethora of different types of forages, some browse, some grass, some forbs, that if all the plants together have what they need and they're diversifying their diet, perhaps they're meeting some of those nutritional needs. I don't think that our supplementation changes those preferences at all. I don't think that they key in on, oh, I'm slightly selenium deficient, let me eat a forb, right? But I do think that given a lot of diversity on land, that they're able to meet some of those nutritional requirements. And so some of those things that I think will maybe my producers could save a little bit of money buying salt versus a complete mineral, right? And that's a little crazy to think because we've done so much research with cattle that says, no, you have to supplement. Well, what is the story of cattle? Cattle love grass. So if cattle just eat grass and the grass is deficient, then maybe they're not meeting their mineral needs. And so I think the story goes in deeper, and I think it needs to be looked at even more. But it is interesting. And I think that where we put out supplement and mineral, animals congregate there. You can make them graze in different areas of your pasture. And um, it's something to think about. And I think for those of us who graze our animals heavily on land and try to avoid feeding harvested feedstuffs, looking at the mineral of your animal, looking at the body condition score of your animal, maybe sending off some samples to some county extension agents or some other people you know, taking all these tools that we have on our belt and utilizing them to some degree will help us ultimately make the best management practices. And so I don't have all the right answers, and I think that every time I explore a question, I just have more questions. But nutrition is important. I think there's a lot of ways that we can help our animals overcome things by feeding them properly. And so, with that, I can take a couple questions. I apologize. I probably spoke right up to my time, but thank you very much.